Hey everyone, and thanks for jumping back into the cryptoverse. Today, we're going to talk about Bitcoin, and we're going to be discussing yet again the theories of lengthening cycles and diminishing returns. If you guys like the content, make sure you subscribe to the channel, give the video a thumbs up, and also check out the sale on the premium list at intothecryptoverse.com. That sale is going to end on March 6th. Okay, so make sure you check it out, lock in the low rate. You'll get access to all these ROI charts, regression charts, on-chain charts, social metric charts, derivative charts, etc. Risk dashboard, Telegram alerts channel. You get access to a lot of stuff, so you can always try it out, see if you like it. As long as you do not cancel, you can keep the lower price. Okay, let's go ahead and jump in. So we've put out two theories on the channel since 2019. And I wanted to kind of discuss where we are today. I like to provide an update on this every couple of months or so to see kind of where we are. Okay, so we have two theories. One is lengthening cycles, the other is diminishing returns. But we've always said you could have one without the other, or you could have both together, or you could have neither. Now, the neither has now been, it's no longer a possibility, right? We're either going to have one or the other or both. Not having either one doesn't make any sense anymore. Why? Because in order for us to not have diminishing returns anymore, we would at least have to put in a lengthened cycle. And if we put in a lengthened cycle, then at that point, it is a lengthened cycle with a new all-time high, regardless of what happens after that. So if 69K were the peak, then you would have had diminishing returns without lengthening cycles. If 69K were the peak, you would have had diminishing returns without lengthening cycles. If we put in a new high, then you'll have a lengthening cycles, but we won't yet know if we have diminishing returns. Now, even if we do put in a new all-time high, I would argue that the likelihood of putting in some, diminishing returns is still very high, because in order for us to not have diminishing returns, Bitcoin would have to go to, say, $300,000 before the next halving, and I just don't really see that happening. Okay, I mean, I think it's possible for Bitcoin to put in new all-time highs before the next halving, but I don't think it's possible that we'll see Bitcoin go to 300K by the next halving. So I want to talk about kind of where we are today. What are some things that we would look towards to potentially invalidate lengthening cycles, and then manage our risk accordingly? Okay, so that's the purpose of the video. All right. So the first thing you'll remember from the idea of lengthening cycles is that from one cycle to another, you typically, what we've seen, you've add 1 to 1.5 years. So this was an extra 1.5 years from 1 to 2, from 2 to 3, it was an extra year. And that's why we said, look, if we do have a lengthened cycle, it probably wouldn't just peak in Q1 of 2022. It would likely go out many hundreds of days beyond. Okay. And that's why I've said before, it could easily be between the 1400 to 1600 day mark, if in fact we are going to see it, which again, there are no guarantees. Now, one of the reasons why we also talk about diminishing returns is because if you switch this over to a linear scale, you can really see it quite clearly, right? The idea that we have diminishing returns from one cycle to another. And furthermore, when you look at this chart, if you say took cycle 1 as your benchmark for when cycle 2 had to peak, then you potentially would have sold everything here, and then you would have seen the parabolic rally come later on. In the same manner, if you sold everything when cycle 2 peaked and cycle 3, you would have missed the parabolic rally that cycle 3 had later on. Therefore, the idea is that why assume that we had to have a parabolic rally at the end of 2021 when there was no evidence to suggest that had to happen. And we didn't have a parabolic rally at the end of 2021. We just put in a double peak in the short term. I mean, regardless of whether we put in a new all-time high this year or next year, we still cannot claim that it wasn't a double peak. It was. It just depends on how long does it take us to put in a higher peak. And for now, we can say, look, the parabolic rally, the primary parabolic rally we saw this cycle was actually in late 2020 and early 2021. Since then, we've more or less just gone sideways, right? More or less, Bitcoin has just gone sideways. So now we want to talk about, okay, lengthening cycles would mean putting in new highs before the next halving. Diminishing returns, we've already experienced if 69K is the peak. Okay, so we have to consider if 69K is the peak, then we would have had diminishing returns. We would not have had a lengthened cycle unless you measure it from the halving. Okay, so as measured from the halving, it would have lengthened, but not as measured from the market cycle bottom. Therefore, we need to consider, what is the downside risk? and then talk about the various possibilities here. So if the lengthening cycle theory is going to pan out, then we would expect something where it still can slowly trend up with time and then potentially put in some type of market cycle peak way over here. Potentially way out in 2023. I know this sounds crazy, but listen, this stuff sounded crazier in 2019 when I first said it. And then in 2020, it also sounded ridiculous. In 2021, everyone was saying we're going to go to 300K that year. That didn't happen. And I mean, we've basically just been going sideways for the last year. So I'm not saying it has to happen, but it does seem like a better possibility than it did once upon a time. Now, what are some things that would invalidate lengthening cycles? Well, I think we have to always go back to, stuff like the fair value and say, you know what? If Bitcoin were to drop back down, there's a lot of people calling for Bitcoin to go back to say $10,000 to $15,000. If Bitcoin goes back down to those levels, then I think it's pretty clear that, that lengthening cycles is out of the question, right? In that case, you're not going to see lengthening cycles if Bitcoin's going back down to 15K. Why do I say that? Because, if Bitcoin goes back to 15K, you're talking about an 80% drop, more or less, right? An 80% drop would get us back down to 13 to 14K. So if we see that happen for Bitcoin, I don't think anyone's going to sit here and claim that the cycle is lengthening anymore. We would say, all right, guys, the theory did not ultimately pan out. On the other hand, if Bitcoin holds the fair value logarithmic regression line like it's been doing recently, then you could argue that there still is hope that we could come back up and put in a new high later on, either this year or sometime in 2023. So it's a lot to consider. Obviously, there are no guarantees. If you actually zoom in, this fair value line so far has been actually quite the champ. With each wick, literally going down to the fair value, right? Down. This one went to 33K. This one went to 34K. Remember, the fair value is a monotonically increasing function. So here, the fair value was 33K, fits all data. Here, it was 34K or so. And you can see that was where each wick was, in fact, balled up, okay? So from here, I think what we need to think about is what would invalidate it, right? Listen. I will not hold on to the theory if we're coming down to these levels and doing something like this. If we do something like this, then we just have to accept we're in a new cycle, right? We're just simply in a new cycle. If Bitcoin is going back down to 15K and then going sideways for another 1 to 2 years, which, by the way, that's what happened in 2018. That's what happened in 2014. And then that's what happened over here in 2012. So, for instance, if Bitcoin were to repeat some type of structure like this, or like this, or like this, and it repeats it over here, and we come back down and then have to spend a long time over here before going on another rally, in that case, I think it would be fair to say, all right, guys, lengthening cycles is dead. We no longer have them. We did, in fact, have diminishing returns, but not lengthening cycles. On the other hand, if Bitcoin holds the line, right? If it holds the line at these levels and we ultimately trend higher, then you could, in fact, argue that the cycle has still very much lengthened. Okay, so there's a lot of subjectivity to the idea of lengthening cycles in the first place. I still contend that Bitcoin this cycle has gone through several mini bull markets and mini bear markets. I think that's best represented by just looking at when it's below its bull market support band and above it. Like in 2017, we just had a long period of time where we just stayed above it. We had one long bull market and then one long bear market. But this cycle has been fueled by mini bull markets and mini bear markets. So it's been all over the place rather than what we saw back in 2017. So do consider that the cycles have changed to some degree as compared to last cycle. It's not just one continuous rally that goes up 100x over 2 years. It's filled with several boom and bust cycles. So really, this cycle has definitely been filled with, the bulls being right for a while, the bears being right for a while. Just goes back and forth. Okay, right now, obviously, the bears have been winning. Today, the bulls are winning. Bitcoin's up 10%. But over the last several months, you can see the bears, in fact, have been in control. But right now, Bitcoin is still holding the fair value logarithmic regression trend line. So, when I go over here and I look at where Bitcoin is today, and I say, and if I went back to my 2019 self and talked about, okay, where would Bitcoin be at this time, I would still expect this to take another several hundred days before we would see some type of market cycle top with a parabolic rally to kind of finalize things. But with that said, I don't want people to bet the family farm on a theory that might not pan out. So while I still hope it pans out, I do want people to consider the downside risk. And the downside risk, as always, are these longer term moving averages that we've looked at, right? Like there's a 200-week moving average. We've had wicks before to the 300-week moving average. It's not that the bears are crazy, right? The bears are just simply looking at the Bitcoin price chart, and they're saying, we are in fact below some of these longer term moving averages, right? Like when we're below the 50-week, typically we go to the 200-week, right? This is what we've seen in the past. They're not just being bearish for the sake of being bearish. They're being bearish because they actually think that there's a higher probability that Bitcoin is going to go back down here than continue to put in new highs. So I think it's important to not be overly deterministic about anything, but if anything you're going to be deterministic on, it should be that Bitcoin trends up with time. I would argue that Bitcoin still has a lot of work to do for the lengthening cycle theory to play out, because we're still, even with the rally today of 10%, we are in fact still below the bull market support band. Okay, we're still below it. We need to get back above it and then hold it as support. Bitcoin could rally close to $50,000, but if it doesn't break this and then hold it as support, then it doesn't really mean anything in terms of putting in new highs. So a lot of work to do. We'll be here every step of the way. We'll see what ultimately prevails. Obviously so far, diminishing returns has held up pretty well, especially as a function of time when compared to the last cycle. Lengthening cycles has not yet been proven, not as measured from the market cycle bottom. It was proven from the halving, by about a month, but it has not yet been proven from the market cycle bottom. So we're going to have to wait a while longer to see what happens. If you guys like the content, make sure you subscribe to the channel, give the video a thumbs up. We also do have the premium list sale at intothecryptoverse.com. Make sure you lock in the low rate. You'll get access to all these charts. Thank you guys for tuning in. I'll see you next time. Bye.